Hi, I'm Aga Bajer.
Hi, I'm Shani Person.
Welcome to The Deep Dive, a monthly Culture Lab podcast where we dive headfirst into a topic that is crucial for building thriving cultures at scale. Join us as we geek out and explore the intricacies of culture, discussing everything from the latest trends to timeless philosophies.
With each episode, we take a deep dive into a specific area, offering unique perspectives and insights on how to create and sustain a culture that fosters growth, innovation, and success.
Whether you are a business leader, HR professional, or just someone interested in understanding how cultures work, the Culture Lab's Deep Dive is the show for you.
So sit back, relax, and get ready to take the plunge into the fascinating world of culture with us.
And today we're going to talk about rebuilding trust and a resilient workplace culture after a crisis. I really can't wait to share the conversation we had with Shani, but first, a quick announcement. We are really close to wrapping up our long-awaited Codifying Company Culture accreditation program for culture practitioners. There are literally decades of work in the field of culture that led me to develop this unique methodology. And then we have been testing and improving it continuously for the past 6 years. And I have to tell you, our clients love this approach. There is nothing quite like tapping into the wisdom of an entire organization and harnessing the power of stories to codify and improve company culture. In fact, we've had so many requests for this type of work from client organizations that we can no longer meet the demand with our current internal capacity. And this is why I decided to share this methodology with the first ever cohort of practitioners outside of CultureBrained consulting. If you're in charge of codifying your culture, or if you're a consultant who supports clients in the process, this is a program for you. If you'd like to learn more about the program and get on the waiting list, go to tinyurl.com/accreditation program. And there's a link in the show notes. Hi, Shani.
Hi, Aga.
Good to be with you here today again.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be back here and see where this conversation is going to take us.
I know, me too. And also a little bit daunted because we do have a heavy topic today. So this month, I want us to do a deep dive into culture in crisis and how to deal with it and how to heal from collective trauma in our companies. So let's start with our check-in question, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's do it. So what is the biggest collective trauma or culture crisis that you experienced personally during your work life? And was it addressed? And how? And what have you learned from it?
Similar to most people, I've been in different size companies. Actually, one of the most traumatic things I've seen, and I don't think we give it enough credit as traumatic, is cyclical layoffs.
Oh, yeah.
It's this like recurrence of every May, every September, there's a new collective process and there is another 800 and there's another 1,000 and there's another, whatever amount of people is coming out from that. Was it addressed? Yeah, I think in the big organizations where I have been, usually there's a process around it, right? There's still some sense of predictability, which is good. And I guess it can kind of calm our nervous system in a sense that, okay, we know this is how it's set up. There's the negotiations, there's the packages, there's this, that, this is the help I might get. My reflection on this, and also having seen this through my career and through my own evolution and learning, is these processes are not set up in a way that takes into account our human way of reacting to these things. Just on a very physical level, our nervous system and how we actually react to this with a sense of threat and a sense of fear and a sense of instability. And then the question comes, why are we not efficient? And why are we not this? Of course we're not. We're like constantly rooting up our teams and throwing people around and threatening their existence and their space and their spot, and having people being protective of their roles and their work. Because I think that's one of the big symptoms I've kept seeing is people don't want to include others as much. They don't want to co-create. They're kind of defending their chairs and their seat because what if they're next? Instead of having this more open space, then we all get to this low-key fight or flight stage where our collaboration is impaired, even our creativity, our intelligence overall is kind of reduced. So I think, yeah, I've seen these processes. I've seen them again and again. I see that we do things. I think my learning is we're not doing enough on the human side of it to actually like help counteract just this very individual reaction that happens to each of us in these processes.
Yeah, let's put a pin in this because I'm curious to ask you what would be more human ways to address this. But I also want to ask you what worked in that process? Like, what were your learnings on the positive side? So, like the processes that were set up and the things that have been done, was there anything that helped a little bit at least?
Yeah, I think there were things in terms of kind of managing expectations. I know there's a complexity to these processes because there are things you can display, there are things that you can't. And I understand that's a balancing act also from that side. So, and it's weird, right? Because it's the things that simultaneously are good, but they also create worry, is actually being transparent. We're looking at a change. Here are the departments that are going to be impacted. And that creates worry in those departments, but it eliminates worry in other places. There's this sense of expectation management and transparency to the extent that's possible that I think is quite good. I've also seen processes where there is a lot of hands-on, one-to-one or person-to-person support in terms of answering questions. So it's not being sending out mass emails.
Yeah, like we've seen a lot of these cases recently.
We see a lot of these and it just hurts my heart. Having that resource or that ability to be able to sit down with somebody and talk it through, having somebody who's hearing you. And that, of course, depends on the size of the change, depends on the size of the company. I've seen different things, but it definitely things that have worked and have given people the sense of being seen and not just kind of drop the message and, off you go into your own process. Yeah, definitely those kinds of things which are possible to do even at scale if you plan them.
Mm-hmm. I like that. And I think that you really need to just manage collateral damage in those situations, right? Because there's no question that there is going to be damage. And I think those feelings that you've mentioned of fear and uncertainty and maybe not enoughness, especially for the people, of course, who are laid off, and how it impacts their morale and their self-worth. It's happening and it will happen. And I don't think, honestly, that you can do anything to prevent it from happening entirely, other than perhaps doing better business management and maybe setting more realistic goals, right? Like not overhiring thoughtlessly. And I'm not saying that all companies are doing that, but we have definitely seen that during COVID, especially in the tech industry, where some of the companies had incredible increase in revenues and business. And so they decided, things are amazing and it's probably going to be like this forever. So let's hire a bunch of people. And then, of course, 2 years later, you're like, oh, it's probably, not great that we have so many people because the business is not there anymore to the same extent. And so what do? Well, we will lay them off. It's like this corporate responsibility around this. I think it could be addressed a little bit better. I'll share mine as well. And mine is kind of heavy in the sense that it was, we lost a colleague in a company that I was working in, and she was actually our team leader. Well, first of all, when she was diagnosed, it was very traumatic for everyone because we definitely didn't expect it. It was a super healthy person who worked out and always eaten very healthily and so on and so forth. So that was a shock. And then there was a long period of therapy for her, and eventually we lost her to breast cancer. And that was a truly traumatic experience for the whole team. And I think it would have been in any case. But in her case specifically, it was traumatic because she was an amazing leader. So I think the sense of loss of a colleague, of someone that we knew and loved, combined with the fact that we felt like we will never, ever possibly have a leader like that anymore in the future, it was really, really hard for the team to deal with. And obviously, in those cases, every single person deals with those issues individually and they have their own process. But I think what our company did that was good was people were offered therapy if they wanted to. So we could meet a therapist and talk it through with them. We have organized several events to celebrate her life and kind of say goodbye together as a group. And that, I think, was cathartic to a great extent. And also the fact that it was ongoing because there is a run now that is in her name. So she kind of lives on. And I think that really helped the team to move forward as well. And back to your point, we often don't deal with those things, taking into consideration how humans grieve, how humans overcome difficulties. That was an approach that had a lot of these elements, those human elements where we actually thought, how is it going to affect people? And what could we do to offer opportunities to grieve together and go through this together rather than, everyone isolated and alone kind of dealing with this. So I think we're back to square one. It needs to be more human, right? And I would be super curious. I don't know if it's a good jumping off point for our conversation, but I'm really curious. So many things are happening in the world right now because, of course, layoffs or restructuring is happening all the time in all organizations. But we also are now facing a lot of unprecedented challenges, maybe not unprecedented, but bank meltdowns again, and wars and climate crisis and social unrest. So there's a lot happening. And I have a sense that we need to really focus on creating anti-fragile cultures or resilient cultures proactively, because I think that the amount of ambiguity and uncertainty and potentially also the magnitude of the crises that we're going to be faced with is going to increase. So I'm curious about your thoughts, and I would love to riff with you around, instead of, waiting for a crisis to happen and kind of break trust in our organization, what are the things that companies can do and our listeners can do to, not to prevent the crisis, because I think we cannot really do that, but what are the things within our control to create an anti-fragile culture?
I'm going to tie this into a question that I got from my 8-year-old this morning.
I love it.
It immediately jumped out at me as you were talking and as we were talking. We were walking to school this morning, and out of the blue, he just says, "Mom, how do you handle your emotions?" Which is a pretty big question.
Yeah,
and I was like, wow, okay, fantastic question. And I was trying to figure out kind of what was his context, and we went on to this, but I went on to reflect on his question also after we discussed, and thinking how I would translate that into the corporate context, because I think what we're talking about with crises, one dimension of that is emotion. It triggers a lot of emotion in us, and it triggers different things for different people. And I think where I landed in my thoughts was that it's a kind of a parallel track where resilience is about individual capability. And on the other kind of dimension is this space holding from the corporate side. And these two are they're not mutually exclusive. They're both necessary.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by space holding?
I think it's about accepting, first of all, accepting that we are humans coming into the workplace. It means when I step in the door and something bad happens, I'm not just leaving everything behind and just putting on my suit and being professional and getting the job done. There is a time and space to also harbor those emotions, like in your example where, you got to have therapy, you got to celebrate, you got to spend time with why and how this is hard. And also in that proactive element, I think planning with the knowledge that this is provoking emotion. And how can we proactively think, okay, what might make this easier for somebody?
Right. This is something that makes me always super curious. And I'm honest here, I haven't landed on the answer that would satisfy me personally, because I have a sense that, yes, absolutely. I think the company and the employer needs to hold the space and support the employees to go through a difficult situation. But at the same time, I also know and believe that it's our own responsibility to deal with our emotions, and we cannot delegate it to anyone, especially to our employer. And I think a lot of frustration in the workplace originates from the fact that employees are expecting sometimes from their companies to take that responsibility for them. I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel that this is a really important issue in the workplace today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that it is definitely something where we're kind of used to handing our power away a little bit. I think it's like in any relationship, really. Whether or not you have a relationship to an employer, which is a kind of an organism, an ecosystem or whatever, or another person, it still doesn't relieve you of responsibility for yourself. Even coming back to the example of my own child, I think that's what we were talking about with him. And that's what he was asking. Like, how do you take responsibility for it? How do you take ownership of dealing with your emotions and not leaving it up to somebody else, not asking necessarily anybody else to play any role in that? How do I know? How do I regulate? How do I move through? And of course, I think as a company, you can also support people in building that capability if you want. But building the capability is my responsibility as a person, and then nobody can take that away from me. I have to own that effort.
Yeah, that there is a saying, right, that you can take a horse to water, but you cannot force it to drink it. And I think that's definitely the case. That I think it is the responsibility of organizations to provide that support and provide those opportunities. But it's equally the responsibility of the individuals to embrace it and do the internal work that they need to do in order to be able to self-regulate and navigate a difficult situation. Because at the end of the day, a really great, probably organization that is resilient, it's probably what's happening. So people are getting support, but at the same time, they are taking the responsibility for what is within their circle of control, the way we think about things. And as a result, how we feel about things is 100% our personal responsibility.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Apart from that, so apart from sort of giving people the tools to deal with difficult situations, I also think that, something that is very important, and we don't talk about this often enough, is investing in relationships. Because we talk about the relationship that people have with a company, but actually what it is a relationship with people in that company, right? And we had a very, very interesting session in the CultureBrained community with an incredible leader, Trier Bryant, and she has military background. She also has background in Wall Street and Twitter and many organizations. And what she talked to us about, particularly from her military experience, was that, when shit hits the fan and things start falling apart as a leader in the military, you need to have built already that foundation of trust and the relationship with your team in order to be able to be command and control. Because that's one of the things that happen when the crisis happens. Very often we need to be full on the task and deal with the problem, and there is really no space or time to talk about feelings and emotions, right? We can talk about it later, but right now, like when we need to transfer, for example, our funds from SVB to another bank, because otherwise maybe we'll lose all our money, it's not the right time to talk about emotions. And I think if you want to be a leader who has the license to do those things, you really need to invest. What do you see? What is the landscape there? Are leaders really intentional when it comes to building relationships with their teams?
It depends, I guess. It's hard to
Depends on the
say.
leader.
Yeah, depends on the leader. I agree. It's always an upfront investment to create trust. I know one of my previous episodes of the podcast that I have is I spoke to a person who works in palliative care. And she works with people who are dying. And that's also a very difficult situation, not just for that person, but for their entire family system or their support system or whatever system they're in. We talked about that exactly, the investment into building trust and how that is something that you have to maintain. And that some people, are harder to gain trust with than others. It very much depends on where they are. And that's a continuous investment, not something you can start doing only when the crisis is there, because then it's not worth anything, because then you don't have the ears and the engagement of that person or those people who are around you. I think it varies a lot. I see lots of great leadership to that. And then I also see lots of poor leadership, unfortunately. So it's a bit of both. I would guess, and I won't speculate as to why, but I definitely think there is something about building that trust that is necessary. Also because then people know that the emotions are okay to have. If you are, as you're saying, in this moment saying, now this really needs to get done, they also know to trust that I'm not dismissing your emotions. I'm not dismissing your right to have them or the fact that you have them, just saying this is not the time or place. And we will create that time or space when there is a moment for it and it's okay. That knowledge of that intention of a person, you can't have that unless you've invested in that before, unless you've demonstrated it before, unless you've lived and shared that experience previously.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I remember I had a leader who was really good at that. And reflecting back, how much time he invested in building trust with the team and showing that he genuinely cares for us. And, this was a very, very busy person, a very senior executive, and he was really stretched for time. But when we traveled for business or when we went out for dinner or wherever there was a time that you could really connect, he was 100% there. Listening, being present and being there for you and showing and being curious about you as a person and demonstrating that he really sees you as a human being, not just a number, not just a resource. And by the way, because it was a consulting company, that's the language often that is being used. People are resources and can start feeling that way after a while. It was really great in making sure that he brings in presence into how he deals with people and also demonstrates in many different ways that you are important and he genuinely cares. From small details like remembering your dog's name and his or her preferences to big things like knowing what you are best at and which projects you would thrive in and which projects would be difficult for you. So I've experienced that and I know how powerful that is. And I also know that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to build that.
It does. As you're talking, I'm also thinking, especially in a team context, when you're building relationships, there are many types of crises that can impact you. Crises from entirely outside the company, things that happen inside the company, things that happen to people in your team. And perhaps, there are also different ways of dealing with those. I know, for example, when the war broke out, between Ukraine and Russia, I had a team with coworkers from Baltics. I couldn't say it was a super specific threat to the business as a whole or anything, but it was definitely really nerve-wracking and difficult for them. And we had set a team meeting and we had a full agenda and we threw it out. We had an hour and a half, and it was this beautiful arc of people sharing their worries. And at some point it started turning into jokes. And at some point it started turning into smiles. And then we kind of landed in, okay, like there was a little bit, like just a little bit more lightness coming out of that meeting. And just the sense of, okay, we all know the work's going to get done in this space. This is what we needed today. And in this team. And other moments when the challenge is coming from inside or from the culture or from those changes, then yeah, that's maybe when you like put your head down and get the work done. And so there are also these different, I think, contexts to play with. And to that point of relationship building is actually those moments that you can really think about what space you're creating as a leader or as a company, and also as a person, what you're bringing in. So it's both. I was just reflecting on what you're saying in terms of just establishing those relationships and that trust, is that there are so many opportunities actually to build it. And it's built around, the little moments and the big ones.
Yeah. And I think the most vital thing and a lesson that I've learned is that you build it by small and big actions, not by what you say or even your intentions, which I think is very often the problem for all of us, because we do consider ourselves good, nice human beings with nice intentions. If sometimes we don't act on these intentions, we think it's human and we just sometimes cut ourselves some slack. Having good intentions is not enough. And this is not the basis upon which your team is going to evaluate whether they can trust us or not. And I've learned it the hard way. Sometimes life takes over and you are really busy, and then suddenly you wake up and you're thinking, wow, it's been 2 weeks and I haven't had a conversation with this person at all. And they tried to reach out and I dismissed them because I was in a client meeting, and that was okay in the moment, but I actually didn't call them back on time to ask what was going on. So yeah, I think that we regularly need to check in with ourselves and ask ourselves, am I really doing that talk, or am I just telling myself that I'm, this nice, caring person?
Yeah, I like that. And it actually brings me back to our previous discussion where we're also talking about that actually putting things into action, values, intentions into action. That's maybe also part of this taking responsibility for your own resilience and for your own way of stepping into situations. I love what you're saying there, is checking in with yourself, is looking yourself in the mirror. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's super confronting. And sometimes you look in the mirror and you see where you actually didn't do that well, or you didn't really live up to your own intentions. And it's human. At the same time, it's just then what do you do with it? I know with my podcast guest on palliative care, she said, yes, it happens. It happens that we change things. It happens that we don't live up to all our promises, that we don't deliver on everything. What in that moment, how much is actually worth to share from a very transparent place? Hey, I see that I didn't show up here. It's not an excuse. It's because of this and this.
Yeah, I think it's such a perfect segue to open this up, because there are a lot of things that we can do proactively. But when something happens and we need to clean the mess, I hear you and I agree. And I think that the most important thing to say is show up with our full humanity transparently and say, I now realize that I actually haven't showed up in the way that I wanted. And I'm sorry about that. Let's take it from here. I'll do what I can to make it up to you, and let's move forward in a different way. And just show that you hold yourself accountable. Because I think that, again, is a huge trust building tool, not just with our team members, but also with ourselves, I feel. because, there's always this conversation happening in my brain around working out, for example, where I have so many fantastic excuses why I cannot today. And then when I actually admit that I'm messing up here and I've committed to something and I'm not doing it, it helps me to hear that. It's like really helpful, a helpful exercise to admit not just to others, but obviously it is, but also for ourselves so that we can hear it and feel more accountable.
And I think that also plays out in a collective, in a corporate space. As you were talking, immediately I'm thinking all the employee surveys, for example, and how it happens that those are very unflattering for certain groups, for certain leaders, for different parts of the organization. And I've seen a lot of times and everyone sees these results, mind you. It's not, they're not hidden. These are results that everyone gets to see, and still communication comes out and it's just about all these things we're doing so well. Great. But here are these things that are just going down, and where perhaps even this is a criticism against management, and there is no meeting that feedback, and there is no saying, hey, we see this. We're seeing that this isn't ideal.
Right? This is one of the first things that you need to do as a leader. This is what Satya Nadella did in Microsoft. He realized that it was a culture where everyone was hiding and basically pretending that they are not making mistakes. And he said, no, our number one priority from here on is going to be developing a growth mindset. And that means, number one, you as a leader, you go first and you actually admit to, what you are working on. What are you trying to learn? One of the things that I've done that was super helpful actually is the following. I struggled quite a bit with giving feedback. And the reason for that is that I think I'm wired to be a people pleaser. And so giving feedback that is pleasant and reinforces the positive stuff that people are doing, piece of cake. But when I need to address performance with my team members, it's really torturous for me. And I'm literally sweating in these conversations. I think I've gotten better. And the way I've gotten better, paradoxically, was by admitting to my team members that I'm struggling and that I want to start working on giving them feedback from a place of care, but with a lot of clarity and specificity. And before we started the conversation, I asked them to listen to what I have to say and then evaluate me at the end. Like, was it caring? Was it specific enough? Is it helpful for you? And, it's amazing when you open this loop of learning as a leader. It does a lot of things. First, it helps you, but it's a very loud and clear message. It's okay to mess up as long as you learn from it.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I also think that makes me think of another person that I've learned a lot from. I did a little bit of dabbling in neuro leadership. She works with alternatives to feedback or a meaningful conversation. And I think you touch on that with what you're saying. Is what she talks about is also about not making it about judgment or about evaluating like whose opinion is worth more here. It's about we're in this space together, right? In a workspace that we're sharing. It's about a common goal to achieve something as a team or as a partnership or whatever the construct is. Leaving the space open for both to share how they're perceiving the movement towards this goal is a very different discussion than me sitting in front of you and piling my judgment on you, which is extremely threatening to your nervous system. Whereas, as you were saying, I would love to see this for you, or I would love to give you this. Then you can like unify on how are you communicating to reach that point, which is a very different starting point. So I think, yeah, part of that is, of course, admitting that you don't know everything and here's how we share this as a space for discussion. Yeah, it made me think of that as well. And I think that's part of any learning is also that humility, right? That we don't know.
Yeah. And I think that companies that have dealt well with crises, there was always this element of reflection and evaluation of what happened and taking ownership of the mistakes that have been made, whether it's layoffs or restructuring that didn't go so well, or even just acknowledging the fact that by the difficult decisions that needed to be made, people were hurt or threatened or their lives were disrupted in some way. And we're acknowledging that, we understand that this is happening. It's a really important element during and after something happens. And I'm wondering whether you have any more thoughts on that, what you can do when you are recovering from something. Because I think a lot of teams right now have been affected already by something. Trust has been undermined. It feels a bit yucky. And no one knows really, how do you rebuild, right? What do you do apart from saying, we've made these mistakes. Let's move forward in a positive way.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind for me, mind you, I feel very humble about this whole topic because I think it's so big. It's complex internally, it's complex externally, it's definitely complex on a collective level. So I can only share tools that I've picked up along the way. One thing that I learned through the neuroleadership is, I don't know if you learned about the SCARF model from David Rock. So SCARF is status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. These are kind of our main 5 triggers in or out of your fight, flight, or freeze system. When either of those are threatened, which a lot of these things that we're talking about, they might threaten your status or your sense of fairness or your sense of stability or certainty. Either it's all of them or a few of them. Then it pushes you into that reaction. And it does that for all of us. Nobody gets to skip the step of feeling threatened. We just get to work with our resilience and our ability to move out of it in perhaps more efficient ways. That to the point exactly. And also after I learned that and kind of looking back on my own life, I think whether you do it on an individual level, a team level, or more collective level is actually addressing one or several of those. So give back something or take back something for yourself or give back something to people, which helps them restore that balance inside. On a very simple level, when I first learned this, my very first example of this was when I had my first child. And it's not traumatic, but it's definitely something that destabilizes you as a person. All of a sudden, you are somebody else. And you have this new responsibility and it throws you off. I won't say it's trauma because it wasn't for me, but it might be for some people. But it definitely pushes you and confronts you in different ways. And one of the things I did was every day I decided I would always get up and get dressed, take a shower and get dressed in real clothes. I wouldn't just lounge around in the house. It sounds like such a simple thing, but I just was one thing I took control of. As much as I hate that word, I think control is an illusion also, but something that I felt like I can concretely do and touch that would like just preserve my sense of that I can impact something. And I definitely think that that is part of any recovery in any system is how do you help people take it back from themselves and give it back to people? How do you, restore that kind of sense of routine, sense of mission, sense of, well-being, just providing that space with whatever it is. And I also think, we sometimes overcomplicate it in terms of it doesn't need to be big. It just needs to be, hey, here is something. With all this mess, whatever it is, here's the one thing we can do right now. How do we gather around that?
Yeah. And giving people that sense of agency, it can be so incredibly powerful. I want to share a very practical tool around this that I've learned recently from Trier again. She talked about this exercise called Dear Company. And she says, in order for people to be able to move on from something that happened, sometimes you just need to vent and express some of your frustrations in a way that is safe and in a way that allows you to process your feelings. So she said what she actually did with her teams was, and she would write her letter first, and was basically saying, "Dear company, F you." And then she proceeded to say why. And you either burn those letters, and by the way, these were handwritten letters, or if it's valuable feedback for leadership and leadership is open to it. And she said she has taken some of these letters to leadership with the permission of the individuals and anonymously, obviously, so that leadership knew how people felt. And it's a ritual which I think is necessary in situations like that because it really helps us move forward very often. I think this is why we have rituals in our lives, in those moments of transition, and they mark a moment and give it a deeper meaning. I love this exercise. I think I'm going to use it going forward because it does strike me as a very powerful one. And then what she did is she would actually go back to that ritual if people started complaining again about something that was in the past. She would say, "Yes, we talked about this. It was in the letter and we've burned it. So let's move forward now." But she would also do something very, very practical to give people back agency, exactly what you were talking about, which was saying, right, so this is what happened in the past. We cannot do anything about it, but we can do something about how we move forward. So given the fact that these are our goals and this is our mission and this is what we're passionate about, what do we need to change? What do we need to keep doing? What do we need to reinvent so that we have a better experience and can get where we are going as a team faster, better, with less friction, less drama, whatever it is that is important for your team? It's a simple thing, actually probably deceptively simple thing, but I can imagine can be incredibly, incredibly powerful if you do it with a team. And if you do it genuinely and authentically, right? Because I think people can smell if you're trying to manipulate them into something, there will be a lot of resistance. But if you are willing to engage yourself first as a leader in a vulnerable way, I can only imagine that it can be quite powerful. So for those of you who are listening to us, if you ever tried this, let us know how it went.
Yeah, I would love to know. I love that exercise. First of all, because I always believe in finding ways to let feelings out. If we're just talking about this emotional literacy, then it's also about not bottling up. Since I'm very young, I always had this as a metaphor. I always used to think about it as moldy cheese. Because it's, yeah, this is going to sound funny, especially negative emotion, but any emotion that you're not letting out is a little bit like mold. And cheese is funny in that way because if you take it off, you can still eat it. And usually there's this stage when there's like just this little piece and a little piece and a little piece, and you can cut it off and you can keep enjoying that cheese, or you leave it and it just, it all becomes mold. So I think there's this notion that creating this space to listen and let it out and burn it or remove it, I think is really useful to vocalize. I love the fact that it's a letter because it doesn't force anyone to share it unless, to put it out there. And I like the loop as well because it reminds me of something else. There's a principle that I learned from a service designer that I worked with. And what you do in service design or experience thinking is you interview people in general to talk to them about their experience, about the way they do things. And one of the tricks I learned there, and I've used it a lot in facilitation, is also because what we're talking about here is how do you also help people move on? Because it's really easy to get stuck in this just venting and complaining. And that's not constructive either. It's necessary, but it doesn't bring you forward. And what she told me, she said, you have to listen to saturation. There's another word in Swedish, but when you've listened and you feel like, okay, we've loop backed. Now we've come to this point again. That's where it's okay to cut off. And it gave me also, speaking of agency, it also gives agency to you as a facilitator, as the listener, as the leader of a situation to go, okay, we heard you out. We are here again. Then it's kind of a sign to go, what's next? So just to add flavor to that, I think that's it's a trick I've used a lot to just judge the timing of when it's like, okay, to push towards another question, the next thing, the movement, the plan, whatever is that comes next in your process.
Yeah, I like the saturation. And I think just as a leader, again, you need to be very careful not to fall prey to your own misinterpretation of what's happening. Because sometimes I think we're like, yeah, of course, we've talked about it 20 times. So it's time to cut it off. But often people will resurface issues because they haven't been addressed in a way that was satisfactory. So it's an easy way out for ourselves to say, right, we've had saturation with this, let's move forward. But I don't want to leave it there. I just want to say we need to make sure that we have addressed these issues somehow, that we just don't leave them hanging there. And simply because we let people vent, we consider that that's okay and we should move forward. I love the ground that we've covered in this conversation.
As usual.
I wish we had more time, but it's time to wrap up. So let's do our ritual that we do at the end and share our 3 key takeaways from this conversation. What are yours, Shani?
I think what stayed with me, the first thing is that it's a joint effort from an individual and a company. Each person has to take responsibility for their own emotions and their own emotional literacy and resilience and capability. And the company at the same time has to take responsibility for providing the space for that to exist, for that capability to grow. And it's not one or the other, it's both.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that one of the things that occurred to me during this conversation is the fact that we don't often take a proactive approach to cultivate an environment, a culture, a situation where we can really deal with hard stuff. And it's partially probably because in the Western culture, we have this tendency to avoid pain and thinking of difficult issues. And so just like it's hard to start saving for your retirement, it's hard to invest time and energy in building that capital. And because it's so hard, I think this is one of the differentiators between a good team and a great team. So that would be my number one takeaway, that yeah, if you want to have a great team and if you want to have a great culture, it's pretty straightforward, but it's not easy. But if you do the groundwork and if you really invest time in building trust, in building relationships, in putting systems and processes as well, by the way, right? Because it's not just about relationships that will help you be resilient. Of course, you will be in a better position when things go wrong, and they will inevitably. That's the thing. Like, it's not an if, it's always when. So that was my number one takeaway.
I think the word that I'm left with in my head is agency. And I think that all the things that we've talked about, changes wherever they're coming from, outside, inside, they rob us of this sense of agency, of having ability to impact our own reality. Again, then there are the 2 dimensions to that. There is always the question, how do I regain agency for myself? And that can be very much independent of the context. It's just, what do I need? It might be as simple as taking a shower and putting your clothes on every day, or something else. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that agency can come from very small actions that you do continuously. And on the other end of that, again, to the point of the corporation, is how can you, in those moments of turbulence, as a leader, as a company, help or provide frameworks to help people regain the sense of agency around the shared mission, around shared rituals, around different things, so that they just regain that stability inside, because it shakes us. Things shake us, and we need to kind of, put our roots back into place again.
Yeah, 100%. I want to dive into that concept that we alluded to at the beginning as my number 2 of anti-fragility. And this is Nicholas Nassim Taleb's concept. And to your first point about individuals versus the collective, what he talks about is that you can have a system that becomes stronger as a result of chaos, ambiguity, pain, etc., etc. And it all starts from the constituents of the system and the relationships between them. So let's not overlook the fact that the people in our organization are going to contribute to our organization being resilient. And one of these people, as you've mentioned, Shani, is the people who are listening to this, which, if I know who is listening to this show, you are probably someone who is responsible for the people and culture function, or someone who is working on a culture shaping initiative. And when things get tough, you are probably one of the people who gets hit first because you are responsible for all the people issues. I think for me, it's really important that we take care of ourselves. So there's a self-care element there to building resilient organizations, to build on your previous point, where I think, especially for professionals in this space, is of paramount importance. Because if we can build up that strength now, we will be better prepared for what's to come. But if we don't, and if we spread ourselves too thin, we will not be able to cope ourselves. And when we are not able to cope, the rest of the organization is not going to be able to cope either.
I have to say, as a sidebar, I love what you're saying here also around, in which I think is sometimes really hard to translate into a collective or corporate space, is this notion that the chaos, the friction, the difficulty is often also the birthplace of a lot of learning, a lot of advancement,
Innovation.
Evolution, good things. A lot of good things come out of these and can come out of these if we choose to use them that way. And it's because you can take the negative and spiral it down and just keep digging that hole deeper for yourself and make the chaos bigger. Or you can take it and propel it upwards and create something. So it really struck me as you were talking also is this, there is so much opportunity because organizations are made out of people to actually take this and transform it and create something more positive from it.
So true.
It is it's difficult to translate those sometimes, but I think it's a really good thing to remember, as you're saying, if you are a person who is responsible for this, also asking yourself that question, how do I make this the ashes that something can rise from?
I think this kind of helped me to come up with my number 3 then, which is that definitely in order to be able to deal well with crisis or rebuilding culture after a crisis, we need to have this growth mindset. And so you just gave me the idea to redesign 3 years exercise, Dear Company exercise, and add an element there, which is you vent, but then you also reflect, what have I learned from this? And if this thing didn't happen to me, but for me, how am I richer, wiser, better, stronger as a result of that? Because I totally agree. I mean, it's a huge opportunity, both at an individual level, but also at a collective level, to turn the ashes into something new, into something great. If you are intentional about it, I can only imagine that you really facilitate that process. If you can guide your people in that direction and respect that it is going to take some time and it is going to take some reflection, but eventually something amazing can come out of it. It's a major mind shift. And so I love that. Thanks for raising that point.
Yeah, I like that. I often do that actually in workshops or things, is think of how you transform something into an action.
Mm-hmm.
How do you transform the insight into an action? Because I think we pick up so much information around us all the time. Oh, this sounds great. And then we just go about our day and nothing changes. Nothing changes. And I think this is a theme we keep coming back to.
Yeah. How are you going to transform one of your insights into action, Shani?
Ooh. Putting it on the spot here. I like it.
I know that you are up for it. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, no, for
I
sure.
can go first.
No, I like your idea. I think where my head is spinning right now is a little bit too, and it's actually a learning that I'm taking just from the way you're talking about this, not necessarily everything that we said, but what I see often that you're really good at is attaching the insight to something, like a format, or that's something my head is spinning with right now, which I'm thinking, how do I create more format or structure around this type of transformational thinking that it is more guiding? And I can't say I have answers to it because, but I think, yeah, that's an action that I'm taking with me.
Great. I think for me, how I can translate my insights into action is investing that time. I think I really needed to hear myself say that because currently, CultureBrained, my company, is still a startup, growing very rapidly. And as a small team, there's so much that needs to be done, including, which is something that probably might be a good moment to announce, we're going to raise our seed round of funding to be able to serve our community better. And so, as you can imagine, like there's a lot of stuff, and it's so easy to take yourself off the hook and say, I really just don't have the time. I really don't. But I know that if I don't invest in these relationships and building trust, things will not go so well for us. And so I think that's how I'm going to translate it into action, to be more intentional about creating the space and the time to spend with my people and really want to get to know them as human beings, not what they're doing at work. Obviously, it might be a part of the conversation, but just building these relationships.
I love that. I think that's always worth our time, relationships. I've been having this reflection lately, actually, because, as it is, sometimes you have your routines and then things change in your life and you have to reevaluate how you do things. And I've been working towards like having pillars for myself, not necessarily this exact thing, but pillars that are priorities of elements that I want to fit into my every week. And relationships, they've always been, but now that I'm formulating it, relationships is definitely one of those. And so, I can definitely second that, just finding ways of investing in people and in relationships with them beyond the work.
Beyond the work. Yeah. And I think this is a great place to wrap it up. So for those of you who have been listening to us and enjoyed this conversation, we would definitely love to know what resonated and why, and how are you going to turn these insights into action?
Yes.
So both Shani and I are on LinkedIn, as many of you know. So if you have anything to share with us, please drop us a comment below the post where we share this episode with you. And let's learn together. Because, it's a journey. No one's perfect here. No one is crisis ready necessarily today, but we're working on it, right? We're deep in the mud and trying to figure it out. And so we definitely appreciate if you share your learnings or your insights, because we can learn from them as well.
Yeah, we'd love to learn from your examples. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis El Nabarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
I hope that you enjoyed this new monthly format where Shani and I discuss all things culture. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who might appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you want to dive even deeper into the topics that we discuss on the Culture Lab podcast, and if you want to participate in a one-of-a-kind Culture Accelerator program and global community of peers, you might want to check out CultureBrained. You can learn more at tinyurl.com/CultureBrained. And there is a link in the show notes. And if you are in charge of codifying your company culture, or if you work with client organizations as a culture consultant, check out our Codifying Company Culture accreditation program. The link is tinyurl.com/accreditation program. And again, there is a link in the show notes. And now a quick preview of the upcoming episode. This time, my guest is Cameron Herold. Cameron is the mastermind behind hundreds of companies' exponential growth. He's the author of 6 books, including The Vivid Vision, a remarkable tool for aligning your business around a shared vision of the future, and the founder of the CEO Alliance, which is the world's leading network for seconds in command. Cameron is also the host of The Second in Command, the Chief Behind the Chief podcast, where he interviews COOs and other seconds to share their insights with his listeners. In this snippet, he talks about the importance of people-first culture. Enjoy.
If growing people becomes the last thing, it's because the team is so busy or so myopic on focusing on numbers that people feel burned out. If you want your employees to really stay with you and to care about the company, you have to care more about them first. You have to care about their fears, their insecurity, their home life, their relationships. They have to care about their health, about them as humans. And if they feel so cared for, they're going to go through brick walls for you to build the company.
Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.